Hey everyone, UEBS 2 Hub here, and in this fight we have a battle royale between three incredibly famous tanks from World War II, and one slightly more niche tank. So we have in one corner 2,500 Shermans representing the US, in another corner about 2,250 Panther tanks representing Germany. And you might be asking, why are there fewer Panthers? Well, it's because of qualitative reasons. They have more armor and better firepower, which is reflected in their stats. In another corner, representing Japan, we have about 3,000 Type 95 Chiha tanks. And finally, representing Soviet Russia, we have the short-gun T-34s with 2,500. That said, let's start this battle, see what we could do. But I am excited, and right off the bat, it looks like, woo, the Germans are wiping the floor with the Japanese tanks, unfortunately. Well, unfortunate for them. So let's get a little close here. Now, for whatever reason, the mods, their sound just aren't really all that loud. I'm not sure, maybe it's the game. But I have tried to work up the sound on here. So hopefully you guys can hear it, but it's not really loud. It's just basically, that's all the sounds are. But the Germans have 800 kills, again, mostly against the Japanese. And despite their initial numerical superiority, the Japanese now have the fewest amount of tanks. The Shermans, I am genuinely surprised. The Shermans have the second fewest amount of tanks, with the second fewest amount of kills. So this might come down to a battle of the Eastern Front between the Soviet T-34 and the Panthers, which, if by the time that the American tanks are gone, there are more Panthers, or a similar number of Panthers to T-34s, I would imagine the Panthers are going to win this, because they do have a little bit better damage and armor. But the T-34s and the Shermans are pretty much equivalent when it comes to their stats. Right, they're more or less just reskinned versions of each other. One might have slightly different this, that, or the other thing, but they're more or less about the same. Kind of similar to how it was in real life. They were pretty qualitatively, I mean, just in terms of speed, armor, and firepower, pretty similar. Right, they were more or less the Western and Eastern equivalents of each other. But meanwhile, we only have about 100 kills from the Japanese tanks, whereas over 2,700 of them have died. So this is pretty rough. Now, bear in mind, whoever did these modifications, they did a really good job. But you also have to remember that when it comes down to real life, Japan, it's kind of a meme at this point, unfortunately. Like, haha, Japanese tanks. But the reason for it is, one, because they simply just didn't have the industry for it. Two, they didn't have the impetus for it. And three, well, I guess this kind of explains number two, is because they just didn't have the capability to transport these things, right? Like, they were pretty much spanned across thousands of miles of ocean, and then you'd have an island here, then go another 400, 500 miles, have an island there, and that was their empire. And so when you have to load tanks onto transport ships, what would happen is they would make a 15 or a 20-ton tank, or even a 10-ton tank on occasionally, and that would be sufficient for basic anti-infantry duty. But of course, when you're comparing it against like an M4 Sherman or a Panther, they look silly, but that's really what the Japanese could do, right? Like, they needed something that could go from island to island, and it's more evidenced by the fact that they had their tank boats, essentially, right? Like the Kachi tank, for example, was more or less a tank boat that could go on the water, and I think it could go like 80 miles in water. So bear that in mind. Meanwhile, the Panthers, of course, they were on mainland Europe. They didn't have to transport anything over boat, but they had bad logistics, so they couldn't really repair them either. But it is what it is. Anyways, there are now more Panthers than there are anything else. I'm kind of surprised by this, because I ran the simulation with slightly more tanks, and the Panthers were actually losing. So I'm kind of surprised by this. But just to kind of go over just two more things of history, in comparison to the Japanese, which, by the way, the Japanese have about as many tanks they have kills. Now, when it comes to the Shermans, of course, the Americans didn't really introduce heavier versions of tanks like the M26 Pershing or even jumbo Shermans until pretty late in the war, with the Pershings only seeing combat, I think, in late 44, but definitely early 45, and that was it. But the Shermans actually, now they are highest in number, so I'm kind of surprised they made a little bit of a comeback versus the T-34s, and it might be because there are fewer Japanese tanks for the Panthers to jump on, and so now they're just going for the, their Eastern Bloc enemies. But the reason why the Shermans were kept in combat for so long is one, as the main tank, is one, because they were versatile and they could do the job. Two, they were upgradable, modifiable. But three, you could put more of them on a boat than you could an M26 Pershing, or if you really want to extend it, like an M6A1 heavy tank. So they never really saw the need to get an M6A1 FE tank when they were like, we can equip a long 76mm cannon and it'll do the job just without the armor, and you'll still have just as much capability to transport these on boats to Europe. Meanwhile, the T-34 and all that, like Russia, again, same cases with Germany, they were on mainland Europe/Asia, so because of that, they didn't have to worry about transporting things by boat, like America, like Japan, which, by the way, Japan is now out of tanks. They are gone entirely, and so you saw heavy tanks en masse between the Russians and the Germans, with the IS-1, IS-2, KV tanks for the Russians, and of course the Germans seeing things like the Tiger 1, Tiger 2, and even up to the Mouse. So pretty interesting. But look at these models, by the way. I know I'm talking a lot here, but of course, and again, my apologies if the sound is a little bit low. I think it's just something to do with the mods, but you're not really missing out necessarily on much. These are pretty much in-game mods already, or in-game sound files. So it's not really, it just sounds like anything else. It's not like War Thunder where it's just crazy sounds and all that. But I don't know if I made the point before. This is obviously not how combat is done. So, like the Panther, for example, if you have a 75mm Sherman going up against the frontal plate of a Panther, it's not going to go through, barring an MG shot, right? Like barring the whatchamacallit shot, the MG hub port, whatever you want to call it. And that's really it. But in this game, it's like you hit somebody, and barring their armor taking some sort of thing into account, like, doing, I guess, or deflection or something, it's not going to matter. And so, 75mm or 76mm Sherman hits that frontal hull, instead of just deflecting off like it would in real life. Maybe not the 75 or 76mm, but it does damage in this game, whereas in real life it wouldn't. Meanwhile, if you hit a Panther by the side, underneath where that, I guess, wide side armor is, you can hit him with some sort of HE-filled armor-piercing shell and blow up his ammo reserves, and that would be it. But the Shermans are now coming back, and I am genuinely surprised, because they might win this. But we'll have to wait and see. These guys are clearly ready for battle and doing well. Look at those tracks, by the way. The people who made this game even bothered to put some wear and tear on those tracks. That's very, very cool. I can't wait until we start getting more mods, because having this Battle Royale just makes me feel a certain way, because it's just, it's history in many ways, and I really, if you couldn't tell, I'm a big fan of history, especially World War II, especially, I'm not a fan of World War II, but rather the history associated with it, but especially, tanks and aircraft and even ships at this point. It's all very interesting. So we have the Germans pushing against the T-34s. We still have a strong front of Germans over here. It looks like the Germans, however, are failing to the Shermans. The Shermans are starting to take this match over, and they now have more Shermans than there are Panthers and T-34s combined. So unless somehow we were to get some sort of Molotov-Ribbentrop pact and just kind of cease this fighting here and be kind of allies, so to speak, the Russians and the Germans, I think the Panthers, or the Shermans, might end up winning this. So let's just kind of skip forward a little bit. show this battle in a little bit faster motion, and see exactly what happens over the next few minutes. So from the looks of things, the Americans are pretty much taking over the world, because the Russians and the Germans are distracted fighting each other. And because they're distracted fighting each other, these guys are pretty much just taking pot shots at the distracted Russians and Germans. As you can see, no one's really dying except for the Russians and Germans. The Americans are doing very well right now because they're just killing people who are too bothered or too focused to be bothered by them. So that's kind of funny. I mean, like, you do see some German tanks starting to make kind of a push to fight the Americans, but it is nil, pretty much. There are very few. They are pretty much all focused on each other, as kind of was, happened in real life. I mean, the Germans had, I think, like, what, 2/3, or maybe it was like 80% of their experienced forces on the Eastern Front. Pretty much the Allied forces, the Western Front, was just either inexperienced forces or just fewer forces than what we saw in the East. And, I mean, obviously it made sense. The Russians put so much more manpower into it. However, the Western Front was still not easy. I mean, the Battle of the Bulge, things like that. Operation... what was it? Something plot. My apologies if I am not good with exact names, but you guys get the idea. The Germans were still fighting, and even on the West, they were fighting hard. But, of course, I mean, if I were a German, I would much rather be fighting in the Western Front. I mean, I'd rather surrender on the Western Front. I mean, why would I want to wait until my town was overrun by Russians who hated me, even if I'd been conscripted into the army, like, a day earlier, and they were going to not only just kill me to death, but destroy everything I know, because they had a vendetta against the Germans for, I'm not going to say a good reason, but I could understand. So, that said, we have still about the same amount of Shermans here, and it is pretty much just them mopping up at this point. You have a lower group of Panthers down there. You have the higher group of Panthers, and I think the Panther, if these guys were left alone against the T-34s, the Panthers would win. However, they're not being left alone, and it'll be interesting to see if they get whittled down more quickly than they currently are. But I'll just zoom out here. We can fast forward a little bit and see exactly how this battle takes place. It's kind of funny how this is played out, because now the Germans have fewer than 100 tanks, of course, but it's like the Americans were focusing on them and kind of leaving the Russians alone for the most part. I mean, relatively speaking. But the Americans have been sitting at like 1,544 tanks for I don't know how long, because they just swooped in. And I think the reason why the Americans won, or why they are winning, I mean, I guess in theory the Panthers can somehow win, but, let's say if they have a nuke program, but I think it's because the Japanese tanks died so quickly that these guys just focused on each other, and they stopped focusing on the Panther, or on the Shermans, and thus left their flanks open, and that was it. So it just became kind of an all-out Sherman kill everybody else fest, But, yeah, I mean, the Panthers are... I'm genuinely surprised. The Panthers seem like they're going to be the second ones to go. But it kind of makes some level of sense, again, just being that the battle developed in the way that it did. So let's zoom out a little bit more, just kind of zoom forward a little bit with the time here, and kind of go to the end of the match. And here we have it, the last Panther tank still alive, but not for long. He may have just fired his last shot. We'll have to wait and see. But this is the last Panther in the wild, and he's actually out surviving some a large amount of these T-34, so I'm kind of surprised, but he's about to die in just a second, and he is gone. So the last Panther in the wild is gone. Now these 35 T-34s had to worry about 1,540 plus Shermans, which is obviously not good for them. I'm genuinely surprised that they kept, like, what, 2/3, or, what was that? That's 50, it's about 60% of their overall force alive. Maybe even a little bit more than that. And, wow. Shermans won. That was a hell of a fight, and I did not expect it to come the way it did. But it did, and I think it's because the Japanese had such meh tanks. And again, with the exception of reducing their impact to 0, because if you have flying tanks, then, you know, everyone's just going to shoot the ones in the air. It's just how this game works. With the exception of reducing the impact to 0, I did not modify these tank stats at all. And this is just a result of the Japanese tanks losing really early and the Shermans taking advantage. So as I said, thanks so much for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. What sort of video should I do in the future? But either way, thanks again. And I'll see you all on the other side. Take care, everyone.